Good evening and welcome to CASA's webinar on Modernising Australia's fatigue rules. I'm Jason McCaser, CASA's Manager of Regulation Implementation, and with me is Dr. Robert Forster-Lee, our Fatigue Management Specialist. For the next hour, we intend to go over what we intend to achieve with modernising our fatigue rules with the draft Civil Aviation Order 48.1, Instrument 2019. We'll spend about 25 minutes talking you through what we're trying to achieve, and then we'll take questions from you. In fact, if you've got any questions right now, you can start sending them in to us so that when we go to questions, we've got something to refer to. You can use the tool at the bottom right of your screen to send us those questions. So what I'll cover is a little bit of background, how we've got to where we are today, what's coming up next, and then I'll hand over to Robert to discuss the key changes in the draft instrument. Then I'll go through the industry timetable and go through key points and take your questions. So where have we come from? Look, for the longest time, Australia's fatigue rules have been in CAO 48. And along with that CAO, there's been a raft of standard industry exemptions. You'll note the question mark on the word standard because there's been a fair bit of variation between different operators for those industry exemptions. Within some of those exemptions, we've got things called fatigue management systems or fatigue risk management systems, and they are different to what we're calling a fatigue risk management system under the new rules. In 2013, CASA introduced CAO 48.1, Instrument 2013, basically modernising Australia's fatigue rules based on the existing fatigue science at the time. We also updated those rules in 2016. Subsequently, we received significant feedback from industry that the rules were too conservative and were going to have an unacceptable economic impact. And so the CASA board directed an independent team to conduct a review of our fatigue rules. They conducted that review over 2017 and released their final report with 24 recommendations for CASA to implement to improve our fatigue rules. In response, we have accepted 21 of those recommendations following the advice of a industry technical working group, and our response also details how we'll do those 21 recommendations through 54 different actions. So the independent review report was released in March of this year, and we had public consultation for a bit over a month on that report. We got 26 comments, and the responses where people have given us permission to do so are available on our consultation hub. Following the public consultation, we had a technical working group. So the way this technical working group works is we have an aviation safety advisory panel. So there's a group of 6 industry experts who basically provide advice to our CEO and Director of Aviation Safety. That group of industry experts set up technical working groups to help CASA develop and implement regulations. So we had a technical working group meeting with around a dozen people from across industry, large operators, small operators, industry associations, individual pilots and fatigue scientists. So that was back in July. And that helped us shape our response, as I said, with 54 actions and agreeing with 21 of the recommendations from the independent review report. Since then, we've been working on a consultation draft of what will be called the Civil Aviation Order 48.1, Instrument 2019. So we basically produced that in October, took that back to the same technical working group over October, November. We've been going through the feedback from the technical working group, and that's basically where we are today. So what's next? Look, it's really important to us to get your views. We need to hear from pilots, we need to hear from operators, and what we're looking for is, have we got it right? We've got the independent review report. They made recommendations. We've bounced the ideas off technical working groups, so we do have some industry feedback, and we think we've got the order in pretty good shape. But we're certainly open to additional advice from industry, and once we've had that public consultation, then we'll take your advice to the technical working group and discuss with them whether we should change things in response to your advice. Following the technical working group, they'll make a report to the Aviation Safety Advisory Panel, who will then advise Shane Carmody our CEO and Director of Aviation Safety. Shane will take that advice, or will use that advice in deciding to make the instrument, which will hopefully occur in February of next year. Once we've made the instrument, we'll be putting out guidance, updating our forms, updating our manuals, and the sample material that we have available for industry in the first quarter of next year. And for high-capacity regular public transport operators, you're required to transition to the new rules by September of next year. Once we've done that, there's a potential that there'll be further amendments to assist smaller operators, although at this stage we think we're addressing the majority of recommendations from the independent review. But once we've seen your feedback and got the technical working group's advice, we'll have a better idea of whether we need to do any further amendments. We also intend to develop a sample fatigue risk management system. One of the pieces of feedback that we've got is that some smaller operators believe that an FRMS is not really approachable for a small operator. What we want to do is demonstrate the sorts of information that CASA is looking for in a fatigue risk management system for a small operator. Now, clearly, an operator the size of Qantas or Virgin will need something far more complex than what we intend to put in our sample because of the numbers of pilots they have and the complexity of their operations. We also intend to do some internal fatigue risk management system training, and we'll be inviting industry along to some of that training. We think it's important to get a good understanding of what's going on in the industry, so we intend to conduct a fatigue survey to really get the pulse of industry and to see whether what we're doing with the rules is heading in the right direction. And we also want to inform ourselves for future potential rulemaking for air traffic control, for cabin crew and for maintenance operators in line with ICAO standards and recommended practices. So what's in the fatigue rules at the moment? So the current rules are the Civil Aviation Order 48-1/2013. And in those rules, there's 3 tiers of fatigue management. At the bottom of the upside-down triangle that you've got there is the basic rules under Appendix 1. They are relatively restrictive rules and designed to be simple for small operators who are able to operate within those rules. So they're a prescriptive rule set. We set boundaries and say you're not allowed to fly outside of those boundaries. And there's no additional requirements on operators other than staying within those rules. When we move up to Tier 2, we've got rules or prescriptive limits that are more specific to the type of operation. They have some additional flexibility and thus they're less restrictive. However, with additional flexibility comes a lot more complexity. Because if you're trying to push, for longer days, or if you're trying to do multiple time zones or augmented crews, that naturally drives additional complexity. Along with those Tier 2 prescriptive limits, we have some additional fatigue management requirements. We need operators to have a look at the hazards within their operation and ensure that the limits that are available within those Tier 2 appendixes are relevant to their operation, and if their operation is more hazardous in a certain area, to actually reduce those limits to match the operation, or to put other mitigations in place to allow you to operate out to the limits. You also need to do some continuous monitoring and have reporting, so fatigue reports. There's transitional procedures, so if you're moving from one prescriptive appendix to another, there are some slight differences between the limits, between the off-duty periods and the available flight duty periods. And so there's a little bit of complexity around moving from one appendix to another. And there's a requirement to train your flight crew because of the additional limits that are available under Tier 2. It's important the flight crew have a better understanding of fatigue and are able to undertake their shared responsibilities for fatigue management. Then at the top of the triangle, we've got a fatigue risk management system, so our Tier 3, which is under Appendix 7 in the current rules. So the reason that we have an FRMS, which is basically an outcome-based regulation, is we can't possibly design a prescriptive appendix to deal with every situation. Every operator has their own nuances and they're able to mount defences that are applicable to their operation and reduce the fatigue risk appropriately. But for us to try and design that so that it fits everyone is pretty much impossible. So a fatigue risk management system is a customisable and data-driven approach to fatigue risk management. So this requires additional effort from operators to have a look at their context and make sure that the system fits their context. Like I said, we're looking to develop a sample fatigue risk management system, but even within our sample, you'll still need to identify your own hazards, your own limits that you're looking to operate to, and how you're going to mitigate any of the hazards that are associated with those limits. So the FRMS will have things like policy and documentation. There'll be risk management and hazard identification processes. There'll be elements of safety assurance to make sure the system's working, and safety promotion so that your flight crew understand what it is they're supposed to be doing. And it goes beyond just flight crew. It goes to management and to flight operations departments as well. So I'll now hand over to Robert so that he can talk through what the key changes are within the new rules.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to be going over some of the proposed flight duty periods, the daily flight time limits, changes to augmented crew limits, some of the late night operations, or what we call the infringement of the window of circadian low, or WOCL. We'll talk about standby limits that we've revised to base it on the FAA short call reserve provisions. We're looking at reassignment of flight duties tonight, discuss briefly the FRMS change management to more of an outcomes-based and taking out some of those prescriptive elements. Discuss very briefly aerial application with 137Q, becoming a single instrument and not having multiple instruments for 48.1, and of course, shared responsibility. So to begin, before everyone panics, this is not the table. This is just an example to help people understand where some of the flight duty limits lead to. So when you look at the traditional table, we have 6 basic bands. Those 6 bands will remain. But for the consultation, we thought it would be, to be clear, that we'd show it as individual start times with the corresponding potential maximum flight duty end times. What you need to look at with this table in particular is we've increased the number of sectors to look at 8. Again, that was through consultation with the technical working group. And so that will be an addition that will be in the new table as well. And just for tonight, you can kind of see on that right-hand side, there is highlighted times. Those are times when potentially a flight duty period will encroach the WOCL.
So, Robert, on that table, it looks like we're saying that the between 0700 and 1259 is the optimal time to commence a flight duty?
Yes, well, yeah, the research clearly shows that if you're going to start a duty, that is the optimum time for best performance at cognitive and physical levels. Yes.
And then we've reduced the flight duty periods available once we start hitting that window of circadian low?
Yeah. So once the afternoon low starts coming in and subsequent times, you're hitting towards that window of circadian low, and so we're trying to put in the restraint of the flight duty period to reduce that as much as possible.
Okay. And then as you get further into the night, it looks like the limits go down?
Oh, yeah. Well, as with the international averages that we were trying to approximate, they all go down in order to, again, prevent the likelihood of fatigue.
Okay. And can you tell me about the sectors? What happens as sectors increases?
Oh, very clearly, the science has shown that as the number of sectors increase, that's increased workload, and of course, then there's more fatigue or the potential for fatigue. So as you look at the number of sectors, you can see that the flight duty periods are reduced. In fact, at 8 sectors, we have the most restrictive of flight duty periods allowable. But we thought that was important because a number of studies again show that after 5, there's significant differences in performance of pilots.
Right.
This is an FDP comparison looking at the existing SIEs. They're the ones in the kind of pinky red band. The 2013 are the blue band, and the green band are the proposed 2019. And very clearly, you can see that we're being much more conservative than previous SIEs. And again, that's a protective measure against fatigue. Now, here is really what the review was about. And the review mentioned that we should closer approximate the international averages for FDP. And again, our latest revision is in green, and you can compare that to EASA, which is blue, FAR 117, which is the orangey band, and Transport Canada, which is the gray. And you can see in most instances we are falling either in line, slightly under, and in a couple of instances slightly above international averages. But overall, fitting in international averages quite well. Another change is in the flight time limits. It was a suggestion at the TWG that in the table that they were quite confusing, and so that they asked that we remove them. And so we did in the new table. So we've removed, if you notice in the old table, the bracketed numbers were the flight time limits. So we've removed those, and again, with international standards, having removed them as well. The one thing we did do is we kept in the safety net for the two-pilot single sector of 10.5 hours. So even though that's the period where it's maximum FDP of 13 hours, the most they'll be able to fly is 10.5. And of course, with flight training, because of the workload, both physically and cognitively, we kept that at 7 hours, again, to minimize the impact of fatigue. Now, with the augmented crew limits, you might notice immediately there's a difference in the Class 1, Class 2 table, because we've simplified it, again, adopting the international norm, and we've set our limits simply at 1 augmented crew or 2 augmented crew for Class 1, and again, 1 crew and 2 crew for Class 2. Now, we kept the table as it is for the Class 3, because very clearly the discussions with the TWG and in the research shows that the quality and quantity of sleep is just not the same as Class 1 and Class 2 that you can achieve. So that table is very much in keeping with what the FAA have, so very similar to that. So, late night operations. Now, when you look at this table, as you look through 13.1 through 13.4, you'll notice that it gets more restrictive, because as the potential for fatigue arises, we get progressively protective, okay? And that is to avoid cumulative fatigue in scheduling. So if someone's going to be scheduled for multiple earlies, there's going to be some safety built into that. Now, along with multiple earlies or lates that encroach on the WACL, it arose during the TWG about disruptive pattern scheduling and the management of that, because it's those disruptive patterns that can really impact with fatigue. Now, again, those issues are serious and they're important, but we're having to seek further advice from industry before we make any changes in finalizing our position. So I think that's going to be probably approached through another TWG meeting.
Yeah, so basically on the infringement of WACL, what we've done at the moment is we have removed the old late night operations clauses, and we've introduced the clauses that you can see on the screen for the infringement of the window of circadian low. Elsewhere, the window of circadian low is defined as 0200 to 0559, which is in line with general international practice for the window of circadian low. And for any flight duty that infringes that period, the following flight duty needs to be at least 24 hours after the first one started. So what does that mean? That means you can't start at 7 or at 5:59 one day, 5 o'clock the next day, 4 o'clock the day after that, because what that does is it compresses your day and makes it harder to get sleep, which compounds the problems of doing operations within that window of circadian low. Then basically after the third day, we progressively reduce the flight duty period available to reduce the fatigue risk with a maximum of 5 consecutive days. So as Robert said, this is an area where the technical working group, there was certainly some robust discussion around how best to manage window of circadian low and disruptive rosters, and we certainly kicked around a number of ideas. This is where we've landed for now, but we're certainly keen to get further advice from industry, and we'll definitely be taking this back to the technical working group prior to finalising our position.
Okay, so standby limits. Now you'll notice with the blue, there's a couple of important changes. We've dropped down the period from 16 to 14 hours. And under 8.2, you'll notice the standby exceeding 4 hours, where it used to say standby had to exceed 12. So again, recognizing fatigue. Okay. And with assignments of flight duty, the previous limit was 4 hours, but we've adopted an outcome-based approach based on the fitness for duty. So you'll note very importantly, number C, where it says the flight crew member has the right to decline the reassignment because of his or her lack of fitness for that particular assignment.
So this was put in place because the previous prescriptive limit said once you'd commenced your duty, you couldn't extend by more, or you couldn't be reassigned by more than 4 hours. And some operators found that to be overly restrictive, and equally, we got feedback from pilot associations that there might be times where that 4 hour increase actually wasn't appropriate. So, we generally agreed that making it more outcome based and allowing pilots to self-declare if they were not able, and basically having to go and ask the pilot whether they were fit for a reassignment was a better approach than just sticking a hard line in the sand that was somewhat arbitrary.
That's right. Now, this is a change. You can't see what we've removed. You can only actually see what we've put in. But we've actually taken out some of the prescriptive language, and that was a direct result of feedback from the fatigue review. And what we've done, as you can see here, that we've allowed the operators to use their FRMS like an FRMS really should be used, and that is to keep self-regulating oneself, to self-manage. And so they can make changes except for what's called a significant change. And significant changes, as you can see, are any increase in the values that would increase the flight duty period or flight time limit that they've set in their FRMS, or potentially the duty periods. Whereas any decrease in off-duty periods, they would actually need to consult with us before doing. But other than that, to refine the FRMS, they can make those changes and then simply submit those changes to us within 7 days. And hopefully, quite frankly, before any changes are made, they'd be consulting with us about their options.
So basically, operators with a fatigue risk management system would be able to continuously improve, but where there's areas where CASA approval is required, like increasing their flight times and decreasing their off-duty periods, they need to get CASA approval before proceeding.
That's correct. Yeah, that would be a much more consultative process for something like that.
And I imagine they'd need to use their flight safety action group and those sorts of processes as well prior to any changes.
And basically, it's the data that they're collecting that will inform both them that they're able to do it, and will actually inform us that yes, it is possible, because they're proving it as they're taking those measures. This is just an example about the scalability or the suitability of FRMS, especially for smaller operators. I think there is a little bit of panic out there that if you needed to adopt an FRMS, well, how could you, especially if you're a small 3 or 4 person operation, and really your policies. We're just telling people, don't buy them off the shelf. Develop them through your own risk assessments. you might need some assistance with that. And again, we'll be helping people and giving support with that, because it's not just about risk assessment. You then have to then feed that into, well, what training might you need? What assessment tools might we need? Now, again, as Jason said at the beginning, you don't need a quantize FRMS if you're a 3 or 4 person operation, but you'll still need to measure something, to assess yourself and to be able to note that down. And I notice that a lot of people in industry often they come to me and they say, well, where's my scientific data? Well, that's the data that you collect on yourself and that you record, and then you use that. So you don't need fancy statistical analyses. You just need to collect the data and maintain records of it. And of course, you can see where the mutual responsibility comes into play here, because reporting is the key to an FRMS. You need the feedback, or else you don't know if your system's working and where you might need potential improvement. So, and again, this slide's just looking at applying the PSOE philosophy, which is present, suitable, operating, and effective, to fatigue training. And it's just making sure, again, that when you instantiate an FRMS, that your training is really up to date with where the science is at today. So the initial training has to be there, and of course, the recurrent training. And it has to be usable. Again, you have to be very mindful that something that Qantas or Jetstar or Virgin might find very useful may not be applicable in some smaller settings. And so don't just grab something because it says FRMS or it says fatigue. You grab something that your people will be able to utilize and will find useful training. And keep in mind that you need to assess the training that you give. It's not just a matter of, oh, yes, we bought a package and we used it and everyone got their competency ratings. It's, what's the quality of it? Is it really up to date? And did it serve the purpose for your group? Okay. And finally, some last points about permitting aerial applications to operate within subpart 137Q of CASA. Now, again, this doesn't absolve anyone of the fatigue. Fatigue training, in fact, will be required of those who are potentially opting to move to 137Q. So there will be a working knowledge of fatigue and fatigue management, and of course there are limits within the subpart 137. Again, trying to reduce the confusion, all the new rules will be in a single instrument, so there won't be multiple instruments out there. Again, people have mentioned that which one do I need? Which one do I use? And of course, the shared responsibility. I think that's the one thing that fatigue management relies on, is that it's not just about an organization measuring and monitoring and training. It's actually about getting the pilots to assess themselves and to become more self-aware and knowledgeable about their fatigue so that they can make smart decisions. And of course, we're going to be doing ongoing assessment and evaluation of the impact of the changes to our surveys. So that will be not just one survey, it'll actually be a number of surveys over a period of time so that we can capture the changes. So with that, I think I'll hand back to you, Jason.
Great. So where to from here? Look, while we're going through this consultation, and certainly since we've had the independent review, it's important that we continue accepting transition of operators, including those operators who want to move to an FRMS. CASA's convinced, the independent review have reiterated that maintaining the old rules under CAO 48 and the standard industry exemptions is not the best way to manage fatigue. So it's important that we'll continue to accept transition while we go make these new rules. The new rules aren't so radically different that we should stop the transition process. Once the 2019 rules, so once we finish consultation and the new rules commence, any operators who start operation after that commencement date will need to immediately use the new rules. So they'll need to start their operation with the 2019 rules that we're consulting at the moment. However, for existing operators, there'll be transitional arrangements, and the draft instrument will show what those transitional arrangements are. But effectively, what it means is you can use your current rules that you're using at the moment for now. And there's a different period for that depending on which rules you're on and what part of industry you're in. So some operators are on CAO 48, some are on standard industry exemptions, including FMS and FRMS within those exemptions. Some operators are on the 2013 rule set, and some operators are on the 2016 rule set. And this is exactly the complexity that Robert was referring to when we said everything's going to be in a single instrument now. For those existing operators, at any stage you can opt in early to these 2019 rules. If you have a look at them and say, you know, those rules are going to work for me, I want to opt in now, then that's fine. You can opt in early. However, for high capacity, regular public transport operators, you have to comply with the new rules, including potentially an FRMS for your operation by the 30th of September next year, and that'll be a trial if it's an FRMS. And for all other operators, we're giving a little bit longer, so the 26th of March 2020 to comply with the new rules. So basically, for right now, you can keep doing what you're doing. However, by September next year or March the year after, every operator will have to transition to the rules that we're consulting on at the moment. So what we're doing next is the consultation will open in the next week. And really, this is critical to CASA that we get feedback from industry. So we think we've got the rules in pretty good shape. We've got feedback from the technical working groups. And there's still an open question on the disruptive patterns, but otherwise we think it's pretty well settled. But we need your feedback, and your feedback will be taken into consideration as we finalise these rules. You can provide comments by our consultation hub, and the link to that is on our website. Aiming to make the rule in February, and as I said, operators will transition by September next year or March the year after, and we'll keep working with transitions. So that's enough from us for the moment. We'll now take your questions. I've got some questions that have been appearing, but please, get in early with your questions so that we've got something hopefully interesting to talk to. So the first question that we've got asks, who were the board of independent advisors or industry experts, and how were they selected? So the CASA board, basically in response to industry feedback, wanted to get an independent view. So CASA clearly had a view on the rules that we drafted in 2013 and the 2016 amendments to those. But basically the concern was whether we got the balance right. And if you look at ICAO's guidance on fatigue, you'll see, unlike many other things in ICAO, the standards and recommended practices don't provide numbers. And the reason for that is that ICAO recognises the science will only take you so far. The science is basically predominantly looking at single things in isolation. Staying awake longer increases fatigue. Operating during the window of circadian low and getting insufficient sleep increases fatigue. But the complexity of how those things interact with each other is something that ICAO recommends each state go and have a look at its operating environment. So what we did is we got a team under Dale Asia Pacific, so a team of fatigue experts and a pilot to have a look at our rules in light of CASA's regulatory philosophy, in light of ICAO guidance, and in light of what other operators are doing. So rather than CASA just looking at the science and picking some conservative numbers, we've basically looked at all those things. What does the science say? What does our regulatory philosophy say about balancing risk, so safety, but being cognizant of the cost of what we're doing, and what are other regulators doing? Because the Australian environment is not so unique that we should be wildly out of step with other regulators. So there was another question about, instead of consulting experts, why don't we just put rules into place based on the science? And really that's why, is because the science doesn't give us a single correct answer. It really helps advise us and have us heading in the right direction of understanding what's driving fatigue and what things we could put in place to mitigate it. So there's another question here around, do the flight time limits apply to private flights or RAOs training? Robert?
So No, they don't, because they don't currently apply, and they won't under the new regs.
Right. So, for AOC holders and Part 141 certificate holders, the new rules will apply. And it's also a condition of a Part 61 licence that the flight crew members not fly when fatigue is going to adversely affect their safety. However, other than that, the prescriptive rules don't specifically apply to private operations. And equally, self-administering organisations such as RAOs they do have fatigue guidance within their operating manuals. So we've got a question of how is off-duty prior to a flight duty period incorporated into the fold? Many operators do not count office duty commenced prior to an FDP. Can we have a final say on this? Robert?
Well, actually, that's we were considering that all activities prior to flight duty count towards that flight duty. So I think under the new rules that would be something that's taken into consideration.
Yeah, so my understanding is in the proposed rules, anything that occurs prior to a flight, so any duty that occurs prior to a flight is considered as part of that flight duty period, and there's a requirement to have an off-duty period before any of that duty commences, because stuff that you do in the office clearly is going to add to your time awake, which is one of the key influences of fatigue. However, once you finish your flight duty period, so you finish flying for the day, if you've got some office duties that occur after that, that's not counted as part of the flight duty period. And this is where CASA has to take a bit of an interesting sort of position. As the aviation safety regulator, clearly there may be WHS implications of having your crew hang around the office for an extended period after a long flight. But that's not our remit. So we're certainly not suggesting it's a great idea to have a long flying day and then a long office day. But what we do is that if you have had that situation, then your off-duty period doesn't commence until you've finished all duty for the day, not just your flying duties. So hopefully that answers the questions sufficiently for that one. All right. Where can I go to get more information about the new rules and how they'd be pertinent to smaller operators?
Well, you can go to the CASA website. We have a specific fatigue website. We're upgrading it, and we'll be putting not only the regulatory information, but we'll be putting a lot of the resources that we use to help form those regulations, so you can read the research for yourselves. So the CASA website.
Yep. So we're intending to go to public consultation early next week. So at the moment, if you look at the CASA website, our fatigue pages have a lot of information about the independent review, about our response to the independent review, but they don't have the consultation draft that we're talking about tonight. So jump on our website next week and you'll see a link to the consultation. On that consultation, you'll have a few things. You'll have the consultation draft, which is a draft legal instrument, and that legal instrument, unfortunately, is in legal language. But accompanying that draft, we'll have a few things. So we'll have a summary of proposed changes, and that will try to explain in the types of language that we've been using tonight, what the changes actually mean. You'll also find on the consultation itself, there's a structured series of questions, and so we describe the change. Give you an extract of what's in the proposed legislation where it's changed, and then seek your specific feedback on those changes that we've made. And you'll be able to, in that consultation, answer as many or as few questions as you see fit. So there'll be stuff in there that's not applicable to you if you don't do standby, if you don't do augmented crew. You don't need to answer those questions. You can just jump straight into the questions that you're interested in, read what we've got to say about it, and provide us your feedback. So there's a question here about, it's been proven by scientific studies that you're the worst judge of your own level of fatigue. Why does it sound like you're moving the onus more towards self-assessment?
That's actually an excellent question, especially with mutual responsibility. And what that entails is knowledge and in improving the awareness of operators. It's like wearing something like this. I'm wearing a Fitbit, and the Fitbit helps me. It tells me about my sleep patterns. It also tells me about my general fitness, and it gives me information even on nutrition. All those things impact my fatigue levels. And so when we talk about mutual responsibility and putting the onus partly on the operator and partly on the pilots, what that entails is improving the education so that someone can say and is more aware and has the knowledge to use potentially wearable tech to say, I am feeling tired. I am more aware. I am more sensitive to it. So that's where mutual responsibility comes into play, and where our confidence, because of our guidance materials that will cover a number of areas that we think will improve the knowledge and awareness of fatigue in the industry.
And I think on top of that, operators under the prescriptive limits, and even an FRMS, which will have operator-defined prescriptive limits, that sets an outer boundary based on effectively someone who's getting a good night's sleep and who doesn't have a whole bunch of other factors. So there's always going to be a responsibility for flight crew to inform the operator if there's something else going on in their life. You can't design a roster sitting there in the operations department knowing that there's a screaming baby, in the room next door, or even in the house next door. They don't know whether you're going under significant periods of stress. You might be having, some sort of marital crisis, or something going on in the family that the operator is not aware of. So that's why there's a mutual responsibility, but it's certainly not intended to put the onus solely on flight crew. The limits are designed to allow flight crew to operate safely when everything else is going well, and then the onus is, hey, put my hand up. I didn't get a good night's sleep last night. I can't possibly fly the full flight duty period that I'm allocated. Can I fly something less, or can I take myself off the schedule because I'm fatigued? So during a typical helicopter flight, a number of takeoffs and landings might occur. How will this be viewed in relation to sectors? From engine start to shutdown, will that equal one sector, or is there some other definition?
Again, a good question, and we know that there's a lot of the rate of effort in flying a helicopter and rotary is much greater because of that ability for multiple takeoffs and landings, and we do realize that in some of the areas that there can be numerous takeoff and landings, within a single flight period. So at this point, no, we're not doing takeoffs and landings as sectors, but that's something to consider for the future, obviously.
Yeah, so the current definition is basically engine start to shutdown is one sector using that sector table. Yep. But like you say, we'll continue to monitor how things are working with these fatigue rules, and if required, then we'll make further amendments. And again, if that's something that you feel we've got horribly wrong, then we're more than happy to take the feedback, and we'll consider that feedback with our technical working groups before we finalise the rules. Next question is regarding FRMS. So if an FRMS allows duties above and beyond the CASA limits, how can it possibly provide the same level of safety?
Well, so the appendices are very broad, and they provide we're trying to account for a number of activities that go on. An FRMS in particular is an organization's looking inwards at itself and its unique risks. So, when you say, how can it add that same levels of protection? Well, by requiring the predictive monitoring, by requiring more extensive self-analysis, the organization will hopefully be getting feedback and will have the data to monitor itself on an ongoing basis. So it will be able to potentially react very quickly to any risks that arise that were unexpected or, quite frankly, unintended from some of their activities. So the FRMS in and of itself comprises a number of elements to help an organization do that and be effective.
So I guess to me, one of the classic uses of a fatigue risk management system is ultra long range flights. So for CASA to try and define a system for ultra long range flights that applies to any operator that's doing ultra long range flights, we'd have to write hundreds and hundreds of regulations, ifs, buts, and maybes. And what we've done instead is we've said that if you're going to go beyond the prescriptive limits that are within, say, Appendix 2, so that basically limits you to 13 hours if you're operating 2 crew, and a little bit longer than that if you're going to an augmented crew. But if you want to go even longer than that, then you've got to have a really good plan. And not just a really good plan, but you've got to be monitoring, you've got to be conducting surveys, you've got to be doing things like using your Fitbits or actigraphy to measure how much sleep your pilots are getting, and adapt in response to the data that you're getting. So you can't just pick up an off-the-shelf CASA how to fly 16, 20, 22 hours. It's got to evolve over time in relation, in response to data.
Yeah, and you have to remember there's the unique environment, the flying environment, and with some of the modern aircraft and what's occurring with the science that's going into those, again, at this point in time, the research just hasn't caught up. So when we talk about the effect of increased pressure over that flying period, when we talk about adding humidity, controlling temperature, the light and soundproofing in some of the modern aircraft, you can't compare that to some of the classic research that went on with pilots, because the aircraft they were flying in just didn't have those capabilities. So again, that's something that's measuring the impact of those changes with the aircraft is part of that FRMS. So we'll be looking closely at those results, and hopefully they'll be positive.
And I've certainly got some feedback that people are concerned that CASA under a fatigue risk management system is basically taking its hands off and allowing operators to do whatever they want. And similarly with current ultra long range flights, that people can't see what CASA's role is. And I can assure you that under an FRMS, CASA's approval process will require us to have a look at any increases in duty periods and what exactly are the mitigators. And even now, before we go to the new rules for some operators, CASA participates in fatigue safety action groups, to see the interaction between operators and their flight crew and how the data is being analysed to ensure that limits are being changed in a slow and deliberate fashion in response to data. Why are the limits for aerial work longer if the pilots are doing more exhausting work? Look, this one goes to how CASA tries to regulate. Our first responsibility, or the greatest responsibility, is to fare-paying passengers, because they are relatively uninformed about the fatigue risks that they're undertaking, and also passenger carrying flights. Obviously often have a larger number of people on board, so the consequences of something going wrong are even worse than they are when you're not carrying passengers. So we as on behalf of the government and the Australian people, we accept the lowest risk for passenger carrying operations. When you move into things like emergency service operations, there's a bit of a risk trade to be had, because there's a risk associated with going flying and the fatigue risk associated with flying long hours. But equally, there's a trade-off risk at play, where if you don't achieve the mission, there's some other risk at play, be that fires, be it a search and rescue. So we'll accept a slightly higher incremental risk in fatigue to do those sorts of operations. Similarly, where you've got people doing other aerial work operations, the people on board the aircraft are intimately aware of the operation that they're undertaking are far more able to decide whether they are fit for the task, and particularly when there's multiple crew to monitor each other and see whether they're fit for the task. And that's very different to making a decision about passengers who are completely uninformed. And then in private operations, our theory is that we give people as much information as we can and allow them to make decisions and control the risk by controlling where people fly and what size of aircraft. So really we scale the acceptance of risk depending on how many passengers, how informed people are, and whether there's some other risk at play that balances the potential fatigue risk with the operation. All right, so mutual responsibility is all very well in theory, but in a small operation, and even some larger ones, if a pilot declares fatigue issues, he or she is likely to be sacked. How do you intend to protect individuals from this?
Again, we're getting some really good questions tonight, because that one comes up a lot, that, okay, so I've raised my hand. What's going to protect me from getting punished? Well, very clearly, reporting, if you're in a culture, and that's really what we're talking about, is we're talking about the culture of organizations, and we're talking about adding to the enlightenment of cultures. And as we put out our guidance materials, it will start to inform along the lines of fatigue to a much greater degree, we're intending. And so that organizations will be aware that we're aware that individuals are multifaceted, that fatigue doesn't just come from schedules, it comes from lots of areas of life. And if someone is experiencing fatigue and calls off because of it, there shouldn't be punishment in a just and fair culture. Now, if someone feels that they can't report to an organization because they've potentially experienced something they considered threatening, they can report to us and their concerns to us. They can also report their concerns to the ATSB, and that would lead to further investigation, and that would be anonymously. So the person, again, could potentially avoid punitive damage. And I understand that someone's saying, look, in a small operation, 2-3 people, it's pretty hard to stay anonymous. But again, I think that if on our end we're putting out materials that are suggesting that if you work people to certain conditions, that will be fatiguing, I think an organization would be hard-pressed to say, well, I'm just simply going to ignore all that. I certainly probably wouldn't keep people very long.
Okay. So there's another one. Can you please provide a list of contacts across Australia that provide assistance with implementing an FRMS? What's an estimated cost for a GA company to set up an FRMS, not RPT? For example, a helicopter operator conducting tourism, charter, airwork and flight instructing with numerous pilots flying a mix of all activities in a daily and weekly basis. Look, I guess the FRMS is designed for operators who aren't able to operate within the prescriptive limits. And I guess the first stop would be, to have a look at your operation and are you able to conduct your operation within the prescriptive limits? If you have a look at once the consultation draft is available next week, have a look at the revised limits and the revised approach under Appendix 2, for example, and see whether you're able to fit all of your operations within those limits. They're not as conservative as the 2013 limits. They're certainly not as liberal as the standard industry exemptions, but they're an appropriate balance between the fatigue science and the impact on operations. So one of our expectations is that more operators will be able to look at those appendices, particularly Appendix 2, and say, you know what, I can do all of my operations within Appendix 2, and maybe there's not a need for an FRMS. And that might even mean that there's some slight modifications that you need to do to how you do your scheduling to fit within that appendix. However, whether you fit within the appendix or not, there's definitely benefits in the FRMS approach. So even if you do fit within the appendix, we'd certainly encourage you to have a look at the types of systems within an FRMS, the monitoring, the predictive, the proactive, the reactive sort of systems, and incorporate some or all of them in your operation, even if you stay on a prescriptive appendix. But assuming that you can't fit within that appendix, one of the things that I was mentioned earlier is that CASA intends to produce a sample fatigue risk management system manual. So what that'll be is for that type of an operator, a smaller operator who has a somewhat complex operation that doesn't fit within one of the appendices. Here's an example of what predictive looks like. Here's an example of what reactive looks like. Here's an example of what proactive looks like for a small operator, and that will be different to what it looks like for Qantas. So our sample will certainly help. I guess have a look at the consultation draft, see whether you fit within the prescriptive appendix, and then we certainly intend to produce a sample that will fit small operators.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that look, we can't obviously recommend individuals or companies, but suffice it to say, FRMS is not something only limited to aviation. It's used in oil and gas and in transport, in a number of different types of industries. And so you'll find, once you start looking, that there are actually quite a number of consultants out there. And in fact, just last year, I attended and I actually presented at a couple of forums specifically at fatigue and rostering and what is referred to as safety psychology, where a number of fatigue risk managers from across industries were present. So again, I think that it won't be something that's hard to find, and it's not something that's grossly expensive.
Thanks, Robert. Look, we've got a few more questions, but we are running out of time. So I'll take this one last question, which is a nice, easy one, which is the webinar being recorded so I can share it with my colleagues? Simple answer is yes. When we send out the consultation invitations next week, so our standard notifications that the consultation's open, we'll be sharing a link to the recording of this webinar. And yeah, we'd absolutely love you to share it with your colleagues. We hope that this sort of approach is something that helps explain what it is that we're doing a little bit easier than reading a draft legal instrument on our website. But we're still trying to learn as well. So one of the things that we're looking for is your feedback on both the consultation itself, so that'll be through CASA's consultation hub, but also on this mode of trying to communicate with you. So if you want to give us some feedback on the webinar as a process and how we've conducted that, there's a feedback form on the top right of your screen. But for detailed feedback about the proposed regulations, then obviously that opens on CASA's consultation hub next week. I just want to thank everyone for tuning in, for your participation. I've done a few of these webinars, and I've run out of questions on everyone except for this one. So great participation. Please, if you've got any additional questions that come up after we close, please email them to the fatigue.management@casa.gov.au. We'll attempt to get a response to you promptly. And those of you who haven't had your questions answered, we'll also seek to get a response to you. Thank you very much, and have a great night.